the thing that vaudeville and baseball had in common is you didn't need connections. It was based on talent. And vaudeville, and a lot of people that went on to become famous actors, they started in vaudeville. And vaudeville was really the ultimate thing where, the audience is going to vote you up and down. There was always a joke in vaudeville that if you're starting in vaudeville, don't send your clothes out to be clean, because if the people in the audience don't like you, you're going to be gone tomorrow. And so they had certain similarities. They also had a lot of travel. People did come from the lower rungs.
That was Steve Steinberg, along with his co-author Lyle Spatz. Steinberg wrote the book Mike Donlin, A Rough and Rowdy Life from New York Baseball Idol to Stage and Screen. Hello and welcome to episode 106 of the Irish Baseball Podcast. I'm your host, Rick Becker. For the second time this month, Steinberg will be my guest on the podcast today. In episode 105, which originally aired on January 13th of 2025, Steinberg talked a lot about Donlin's baseball career. Today, we will pick things up towards the end of his playing days, when his relationship with vaudeville actress Mabel Height is starting to take him away from the game, even though his numbers are incredible. Let's welcome Steve back to the show. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Rick, and thanks for the opportunity to share the story about this great ball player, remarkable story, the guy who has been virtually forgotten.
It's just so amazing that he could at that point. I mean, I'm just staring at these numbers and thinking about how at that point you could step away. And it must have really been, a true romance story for him to be that enamored and step away from a job where he was dominating. And like you said, he wasn't even making the big money yet. So once he finally does make this full transition into his new career and he is so successful, what is his life looking like at that point? How does he have to keep performing? How much are they performing so that he can continue to make, like you said, $100,000 a year?
Well, as 1909 and then 1910, as he moved, another year away from his on-field success, which really fired his popularity, I think his wife realized as much as he did that he probably would need to come back to the game to once again do something. But now it's another 3 years later, and he really missed the game. He loved baseball. And many times when the two of them were together, and they usually were, and he's talking to the press and he's wavering a little bit when they ask him, "Oh, do you want to come back to the Giants or whatever?" And then Mabel would sometimes cut him off or step into the conversation and say, "We're not coming back until we get what we want." Ironically, one of the years that he was holding out for somewhat more money, and he thought it would be a nice, easy way for the Giants to look like the bad guys. And McGraw wanted him back so badly that McGraw said, "I'm going to pay for it out of my own pocket, and if the Giants don't reimburse me, that's fine." And Donlin joins the team in spring training. He hadn't signed the contract yet, and then he missed Mabel, and I believe that was 1907. And he just left before signing the contract. He wanted to be with her. He was, she carried the show, but obviously his fame brought a whole new group of people into the theaters. Then probably more of a male audience, where she perhaps had more of a female audience, and they were an item together, and they were really independently wealthy and accumulating quite a lot of money.
So what do you think happened to the story of these two huge celebrities who now are not even close to household names? We talk about the other players of the era, Honus Wagner, you talk about Ty Cobb, you talk about even McGraw. Like, these are still names that we hear all the time while talking about the game. How did Donlin and his wife sort of fall into the background? Why don't we see clips on YouTube now?
Right. Fame is and celebrity is an interesting topic. In the case of Mabel, in 1912, when she's performing in Harlem, she collapses on the stage, and doctors very quickly find that it's far more serious than they thought it was. And she's got cancer. Actually, it's pretty rare that newspapers mention the C word in 1912. And you can imagine how that affected Mike. And Mabel is dead in October of 1912 before her 30th birthday. And I get a little choked up when I talk about it. One can even almost wonder. I mean, this is just right around the time that silent movies are about to take off. And had she lived a normal lifespan, when the talkies came out, she still would have been a woman in her mid to late 40s. So in her case, she was gone far too soon. And in his case, again, it's the first decade of the 20th century. It's a very complicated thing. I think Lyle and I have made a writing career of telling the stories of people that have been forgotten. I've done a biography on my own on Urban Shocker, a famous pitcher of the great 1927 Yankees who's been virtually forgotten. And the ironic thing is that every youngster in America probably knew who Mike Donlin was around 1908. And, we fast forward and there's just too much going on in the world. I use the analogy of like a star. It's not like the star has sort of fallen out of the sky. It's still there, but you look at the sky and there's only so many stars that you see that twinkle. There's others that are a little bit maybe overshadowed. I mean, in the case of Mathewson, his tragic death after he was in the war and exposed to a chemical gas added to his mystique. And I don't have an expert answer on that in terms of why he's been forgotten, but it is an amazing story. And he never had a biography until now. And I think part of that is this book took Lyle and me a fair amount longer, probably another year than a typical baseball biography, because to really get your hands around vaudeville in a meaningful way and early Hollywood, which we can talk about, it really takes some digging. And people have been amazed when I've done interviews like this. People say, "God, this should be made into a movie," because his life is his story is sometimes stranger than fiction.
And I'm always fascinated by people who create. So you put together this book, and it must have taken a lot of research, because when you spend 50 years, 25 years researching baseball players, and all of a sudden you have this completely different angle of vaudeville and early Hollywood, and you have to basically learn that from scratch, I'm guessing. So what was the research like going into this book, and what did you learn about not just these two people, but America at the time that maybe you didn't know before going into it?
Well, vaudeville was a very interesting thing, and in some ways, I think that it's come the full circle when you turn on the television now and you see America's Got Talent and all these different shows that really are another version of vaudeville, and vaudeville was really attracted the masses. I mean, there were opera houses. Willie Hammerstein, who had his vaudeville house, his father, who was the first Oscar Hammerstein, loved opera, and he built these houses, and he was losing money head over heels because how many people really want to go see opera? And so vaudeville was more for the mainstream people. And you went to the theater for a couple hours and you would see a whole bunch of different acts. I mean, Donlin and Mabel, their initial act was almost 20 minutes. That was long. And maybe the next person on the that would come on the stage had a couple dancing dogs. And, they were famous when there was a famous murder trial, a murder triangle love story. Willie Hammerstein would bring on stage one of the woman that was involved in that story. And, we tell a story that may be apocryphal, but is very revealing, where it was a sensationalism, almost like the National Enquirer on stage, which is how Oscar Hammerstein's descendant, who I was able to connect with, describe what was going on stage there. And one man came up to Willie Hammerstein in the teens and said, "Mr. Hammerstein, if you pay me $1,000, I will kill myself on stage." and there's something to grab you. And then Hammerstein was supposedly then came back and said, well, what will you do for an encore? And whether that actually was the story, but that was pretty typical. It was, America, the middle class was growing, New York was growing, and vaudeville was the entertainment, and it had to stay, it had to move around the country because people weren't going to watch it the same shows year or month, even month after month. So they traveled a lot on the road, and it became a big deal then.
And I know a recurring theme when we look back at Irish baseball players from around this era is that one of the ways that Irish Americans were able to ingratiate themselves into the larger society was through baseball. It was still a job that mostly hired working class people. Like the wealthy didn't want their kids getting involved in baseball. So, maybe a $6,000 contract was a lot for Irish working class people to be making. So it helped to sort of, move Irish people up through the ranks. And we talk about it often being blocked off to black baseball players because they weren't allowed to play in the majors. They played in the Negro leagues. But then you see Donlin kind of go into vaudeville and entertainment, which was an area that was also used by black Americans and people of different races and the Irish to ingratiate themselves into the society as a whole. So I was just wondering, do you think that this was almost the prime example? He might be the quintessential example, if you will, of an Irish American going from a really horrible background, everything that you mentioned that happened when he was a kid. And then he works his way up to baseball where he's making $6,000 a year. And then he all of a sudden moves into this other growing industry. Mm-hmm. It's almost like the story of Irish Americans as told through this one man.
You bring up an interesting point because until Sunday baseball was legalized, and in New York, it didn't come about until the 1919 season, you had more of the upper class people watching the game. And there was a lot of commentary, and I'm doing a lot of work on 1919 now, that when Sunday baseball came, then finally the working class people could come and watch baseball because they couldn't watch it other than July the 4th, or what I think they called Memorial Day, Decoration Day there. And the thing that vaudeville and baseball had in common is you didn't need connections. It was based on talent. And vaudeville, and a lot of people that went on to become famous actors, they started in vaudeville. And vaudeville was really the ultimate thing where, the audience is going to vote you up and down. There was always a joke in vaudeville that if you're starting in vaudeville, don't send your clothes out to be clean, because if the people in the audience don't like you, you're going to be gone tomorrow. And so they had certain similarities. They also had a lot of travel, people did come from the lower rungs. I mean, Mathewson was a college boy, and that was one of the things that sort of why he was held up as an example. He was more refined, more polite. But it wasn't just, it's the Irish story, but it's a lot of immigrant stories. The Irish came first because they were coming in after the potato famine in the 1850s, 1860s. And then we saw it with the Eastern and Southern Europeans, like the Italians started coming up. But that immigration wave didn't come until between, let's say, 1890 and the beginning of the First World War. And boxing had the same kind of thing. You had the Irish boxers. I become a fan of, and the Jewish boxers, even from that time frame. Benny Leonard, Jimmy McClarnahan, I think was one of the champions. It was a vehicle. Sports provided an opening where if you had the talent, you're going to go forward. And the people that are spending the money watching you are actually, I hadn't thought of it until you asked it, are really in a very different social class. Higher.
And I know you mentioned the working class getting involved in baseball when Sunday baseball was introduced, and you're doing some research on this now. I'm pretty sure I know the answer to this, but was it Al Smith who introduced Sunday baseball in New York, that he said it was okay to do either when he was the mayor or the governor of New York, that it became legalized?
Yeah, it's a pretty common. Actually, there was a state senator at the time that sponsored the bill that finally got through, and that was Jimmy Walker, who went on obviously to become the famous mayor. And Al Smith was the governor at the time. And for many years, I mean, baseball was already legal in the Midwest, less of the Catholic strongholds, Cincinnati, St. Louis on Sunday. And actually, in places like Philadelphia, it was a lot later than 1919. And it was always the Republicans from upstate New York would sort of vote it down, and you'd have, the church groups working against it. And obviously, when Sunday baseball started, the fans were very, very polite, and you didn't have the rowdiness and so forth. And yeah, Al Smith was the governor, signed it into law, and I believe the law actually had let it be determined on a localized basis. So technically, it was the aldermen, which I guess would be like city councilmen of New York City, that said, yeah, we're going to vote for it. So Al Smith signed the law, and then in each community, the community would decide, and it obviously was a financial windfall for the owners of the teams, Brooklyn Robins, as well as the Yankees and the Giants.
Yeah, I know that was one of the things, because I had recently been interested in the fact that Babe Ruth had campaigned for Al Smith when he ran for president. Obviously, Babe Ruth Catholic, Al Smith the first Catholic to run for president. And I know that was one of the big deals, that Al Smith was really into this Sunday baseball, or he was at least given a lot of credit for it.
Right.
Like you said, you're doing the research now, and that's interesting that became a big part of it. So getting back to Donlin and vaudeville and the success that he had, he never did stray too far from the game, though, right? Like,
he always stayed connected to it, whether they had like old timers games, or there would be, I mean, this goes into the 1920s, and he obviously he transitioned from vaudeville to Hollywood. He and his second wife, he was very fortunate to marry a lovely young woman who came from an acting family, but not nearly as famous as Mabel. And he started appearing in many, many films, but he always stayed close to baseball. Oftentimes it would be a charity or a fundraising game. And he became a very beloved guy on the backlots of Hollywood. And in many cases, he had very, very small roles in films, but directors would try to find a spot for him. There's a film clip that can still be found actually quite easily on when you search for it on the internet, where he's in a William Powell movie as a bartender, and in that movie he's on for about a minute or so, and making the perfect drink as a bartender. So he had many of those small roles, although his first film was a feature film. It was like the story of his life. And but then he, in the 20s and 30s, he probably appeared in about 100 movies, but always stayed close to baseball.
That was Steve Steinberg, co-author of Mike Donlin, A Rough and Rowdy Life, from New York baseball idol to stage and screen. We will have him on the podcast again in the future to continue talking about Donlin's career on and off the diamond. I'm Rick Becker, and this has been episode 106 of the Irish Baseball Podcast.